Welcome to the Sage Family Podcast,
where we explore natural, homeschooling, gentle parenting,
simple living, and family adventure.
I'm Rachel Rainbolt, the Sage Parenting Coach, coming to you from the Pacific Northwest, where I live wild and free in connection with my 3 wildlings and the Papa Bear in our fixer-upper on the beach. This is episode 6, and today I'm here with my friend Joy MacTavish talking about breastfeeding. Joy supports families with lactation, baby-wearing, and gentle parenting practices through her business, Sound Beginnings. She lives with her family in a multi-generational home in Shoreline, Washington, where they enjoy reading, Lego, exploring, and impromptu science experiments. So join us around the campfire and let's get living the family life of our dreams. If you are enjoying the Sage Family Podcast, then please scroll down and click those stars in your podcast app or on iTunes. This is a quick and easy way to support the show using the currency of feedback. If you are loving the Sage Family Podcast, then become a part of it through Patreon, where you can support these important conversations, help make this show great, and get rewards doing it. For this week's Adventure of the Week, I met up with friends, including Joy, at a big indoor play place with all the slides, tunnels, and ball launchers. I have to say, I have never been a fan of indoor playgrounds when outdoor playgrounds are free with fresh air and no rules, but we have fun playing new places, so we had a good time. One of the easiest ways that we seamlessly weave adventure throughout our days is to go to different parks when we're on our way home from places. For example, the other day we dropped my dad off at the airport and I pulled up the map, typed park into the search bar, and hit go on the park with the most stars. We wound up riding scooters on this long bike path alongside a river. It was an unseasonably warm and sunny 77 degrees, and we stayed until we got hungry. It doesn't have to be planned in advance. It's okay if it's not perfect. It's about the experience. It's just another way to embrace adventure. So I have watered my office plant and made myself tea, which means I am officially ready to podcast. Today, my friend Joy is joining me to talk about breastfeeding on the natural parenting path. We met through a mutual friend, shout out to Melissa, and Hack School, which is my homeschool adventure club, and her son is just the sweetest. And we got talking about breastfeeding when she came upon my Sage breastfeeding book while preparing for a talk she was giving at a lactation conference, right?
Yep, exactly.
So tell us your story, Joy. Who are you? What are you passionate about? What about your relationships and life fulfill you? And what is your relationship to this topic of breastfeeding?
Ooh, good question. So I tend to define myself first and foremost by my relationships. So I'm a mama and a wife, a daughter, granddaughter, friend, and I have a bunch of degrees and credentials. I really had to stop adding letters after my name at some point. It was just like, just pick the most important ones.
Oh man, I can so relate to that. Every time I'm like writing my name on official things, I'm like, how many, do I need the CEIN? Like how many letters should I be adding onto this?
Exactly. So I have more than I ever use. I had to like drop some I've let lapse at different points. But yes, I have a lot of degrees and credentials. I am just really passionate about lifelong learning. So I did 2 bachelor's degrees and a master's degree and a bunch of other professional credentials. I'm really passionate about social justice. That's really one of my core values. I love mindfulness. I incorporate that into a lot of the work that I do. I'm gearing up to lead another mindfulness postpartum support series. And then, of course, my family and my community are other areas of my life that I'm passionate about and devote a lot of attention and time to.
See, everybody who's listening who knows me is going to be like, oh, yeah, they're friends for sure.
Right. Yes. In terms of what about my relationships and my life fulfills me, I would say right now at this moment in my life, it's pretty much everything. I feel so much gratitude for the fact that I'm able to really share my life with the people I love, and I have a fulfilling and self-directed career doing exactly what I love, that really feels like the perfect fit for my interests and my skills. And then I love that I'm able to meet families where they are, like often literally where they are, coming to their homes in the early days of parenting, like climbing onto their bed with them to help them with breastfeeding. And then I get to come home to my loves, and we get to have adventure days, and we get to travel to see family, and we get to set our own schedule. And I just feel like it's really it's a constant need to find balance between all those things, but they really work well together. And so that's how I feel really fulfilled in all of those things. And then my relationship to this topic is that I'm a lactation consultant, specifically an international board certified lactation consultant. And I'm a breastfeeding mama. I had a home birth, and we had a number of early breastfeeding challenges. I have a kiddo that had a tongue tie and had food sensitivities, and lots of things through our early breastfeeding experience that have really informed the way that I talk to clients and the things that I bring to my professional role. And I've been supporting new families for over a decade. I truly feel like this is my life's work right now, and that finding that balance between my professional role and my parenting role is really where things, have kind of coalesced, and it feels like it's sort of like, yes, this is it. There's no, I don't feel like I'm like searching and struggling.
Yeah. And I love how you're like open-minded as you transition into different seasons of family life and of parenthood with your son, that you're open-minded to seeing how all of the different pieces integrate and fit together in evolving ways.
Yes, definitely. Like I was a birth and postpartum doula before I got pregnant, and then I really thought that I would go back to that, but it became pretty clear pretty quickly that that was not really the path that I needed to return to.
Yeah.
And so I think that, being able to sort of let go of those things, and I love the word that you used. I think it was in one of your previous podcast where you talked about like not quitting, but pivoting.
Yes.
And I just love that idea of like, yes, it's not that I quit those things. It's just that I, like, for a long time I was like, I'm on a hiatus. I'm on a hiatus that just has lasted like 4 years now.
Oh my gosh. Yes.
And then it was sort of just like, or you can just sort of say I have, then I like evolved into like, I have a background as as these roles. But because they still inform the work that I do and the way that I am with families, but it doesn't have to be a part of my current professional identity. And it doesn't have to feel like I'm losing anything. It's just sort of
I can so relate to that. I think because when I started grad school, I technically was in the doctorate program. I was in a PsyD program for marriage and family therapy. And after I graduated with my master's, like for the longest time when people would ask what my degree was, I would say, well, I'm in a doctoral program, or I'm on hiatus from a doctoral program in marriage and family therapy. And then at some point it's like, okay, so I've decided that going back and finishing that degree in this season of my life doesn't really align with my values and get me to where I want to be. So I need to like have peace that I'm like pivoting on that a bit and changing directions and shifting focus.
Exactly. Yes.
Okay, well, we have much to talk about because breastfeeding is something I'm very passionate about, something you're very passionate about. So we are going to dive in. So the first thing I want to talk about is breastfeeding on cue. And I want to start by giving a little bit of context to the conversation, and then I'm going to ask you some questions. So babies give subtle early cues that they're seeking the breast. The more sensitively and consistently you respond to those cues, the more secure the connection and the more delicate the communication. This on-cue feeding also supports the brain-body connection in the infant, facilitates the system of supply and demand in the mom, and meets just about all of the changing needs a baby can have. If you wait until your baby is crying every time before offering the breast, they learn that they have to cry to be able to nurse and will rely on crying as their primary means of communication. If they are ignored through their cries, they learn that they cannot trust their primary attachment figures and stop signaling altogether, though their cortisol levels remain elevated. And cortisol is that stress hormone, and being in the early prolonged states of distress as marked by elevated levels of cortisol, known as the defeat response by neurobiologists, has heaps of negative long-term effects like depression, fearfulness, emotional detachment, and aggression. Scheduled and measured feedings are really pushed on the mainstream path where control and measurability bring comfort and trust is just out of reach. So tuning into the language of your baby and offering the breast on cue is an essential component of natural breastfeeding, where we're really tapping into the system nature has put in place. How do you explain the importance of breastfeeding on cue when you're working with families?
Well, I love your context, and I love everything that you just shared. I usually explain that the importance of breastfeeding on cue is that really in absence of any lactation challenges, in general, the baby and the parent's body become in sync in terms of meeting the baby's needs. And those needs are hydration, nourishment, which I think is what people think of, but also comfort and security and connection and just kind of that touch point of safety in this big world that they're not used to. Yet.
Emotional regulation, sensory regulation.
Yes. All of it. And so, and then that helps in turn regulate the milk production and the hormonal connection for the parent's body. And so when those things are happening, parents who nurse on cue rarely have to concern themselves with how often or how long their baby's feeding. They don't have to, look at the clock or check with, calculate how many hours or fuss with an app or have any kind of external reminders that then shift their attention away from their baby and away from their body. And that, it's just a baby and their nursing parent and they're in harmony and there's not a lot of that sort of external kind of stress or pressure when things are going well. And so for some families, that means that they may establish a rhythm and they may sort of have, not a schedule per se, but sort of, this is how our days look in terms of nursing. And other families, it's going to be completely different and it's going to vary day by day. And that I think that
season by season with the little one too.
Yes. And when you're nursing on cue, you're not thinking about kind of meeting a quota or, have we nursed too much or too little? And so when there are growth spurts or when there are developmental changes or when there's illness or when something comes up with travel or whatever comes up, that it doesn't throw that off necessarily because you're still just in sync.
You can just follow your little one's lead. And that's really the only guidance that you need. I think that breastfeeding on cue, really the base element of it is trust. And I know that anyone who's been listening to this podcast knows that I talk about trust a lot, especially in the context even of unschooling, that trust is really like that foundational base element of like a healthy, connected, natural parenting style relationship. And this is really like the first big moment of that on the parenting journey is with breastfeeding, like getting to that place of trust in your nursing system and your nursing relationship.
Yes. And I think oftentimes this is one of the first kind of opportunities that a lot of parents have to kind of explore following their instincts. And I think that a lot of times, when we're in tune with what's going on with our bodies and with our babies, they're sort of like, oh, it's, like that, the baby was sleeping, but I felt like I needed to go and check. And then the baby stirred and woke up. And like, that sort of like, or I felt sort of like I, was maybe thinking about, am I going to have a letdown or do I need to nurse soon? And then my baby started like showing that sign that they want to nurse. And it's like, oh, I felt like we were, we were right there on the same page in that moment. Yeah. And I think that when that happens, it then reinforces that intuition and reinforces that trust.
Absolutely.
So that then it feels like, they feel empowered about this whole system. And then it goes from there. And then I think that then, like you said, it's the sort of first, one of the first times, and then that can be built upon because then that trust and that intuition can be followed in other ways.
Oh my gosh, yes.
Throughout the relationship. Yeah.
So much, yes. And trusting your baby, and this is like a huge first piece to building that secure connection and that trust in your relationship. And then also trusting in your body, which for a lot of women, like this is completely brand new territory. They grew up or spent their early adulthood distrusting or even having a lot of resentment or anxiety or whatever those feelings are around their body. And it can be especially difficult if you're coming off the heels of some birth trauma, to move into a space of trusting your body. And breastfeeding really presents an opportunity for you to shift your relationship with your body in this new way where you can get to a place of trust and you can get to a place of gratitude and you can get to a place of honoring and celebrating your body for exactly what it is today and how wonderfully it meets your needs and your baby's needs.
Yes.
Yeah, I think one of the first places where like I kept coming up against a wall with the breastfeeding on cue thing was actually with just the medical world. Like anytime we would see a doctor or a pediatrician or even like just people who I knew who were in the medical field, it was like, how often is your baby eating? What times are your baby eating? Well, how long are you going between your feedings? And my answers were just always like, he eats when he's hungry. How long has it been? However long it's been since the last time he nursed. It totally different time duration from the time before that.
Right.
And they don't know how to handle that. Like they don't have a space on their chart to fill that in. And that expectation can build this framework of expectation in the parent's mind that, oh, that's how it's supposed to be. Like, oh, it's supposed to be every 4 hours, or, oh, they're supposed to be this much, or they're supposed to nurse for this long, and all of that. So I think that can definitely set up a hurdle to this foundation of trust we're trying to build in this breastfeeding on cue relationship.
Yes. And I feel like I don't teach too many prenatal breastfeeding classes anymore. I pretty much just teach for a local and really well-respected, long-time childbirth educator and doula, Penny Simkin. I teach her breastfeeding classes and newborn care classes, but I've stopped teaching pretty much all the other ones that I used to teach. But people still want, even people that are taking an out-of-hospital based, birthing class, and even people that, like lean towards this natural parenting way, still want like definitive, like how many hours apart do we need to feed our baby? And I'm like, well, most newborns are going to eat anywhere from 8 to 12 or more times each 24-hour period, but your baby and your body are going to dictate what that looks like.
So different for everyone.
And they're like, but so that every 3 hours. And I'm like,
yeah.
Oh
my gosh, yes. So I used to teach these infant massage classes that were really like parenting of infants classes. And I loved teaching those classes. And I always got the most tremendous and amazing feedback that I was so honored by. But one of the consistent themes of feedback that I would get back is that I was always teaching these classes with my own babies. So I was teaching this while I was having my own little ones. And so my baby would be there in the class and I'd be massaging my baby. And my baby would be doing all the things babies do. So my babies would cry and my babies would breastfeed and my babies would whatever. They'd spit up, they'd do all the things babies do. And that was one of the like pieces of feedback that I kept getting that was surprising to people, was that like my baby would just like I'd be teaching and talking and the baby would nurse, and like I wouldn't be like worried about it, or I wouldn't be like focused on like how much time has gone by or how long they're sitting at each breast, or how like somehow we just knew and they would just nurse and then they were done and then they would crawl away. Like it just what that looks like, I guess I'm saying. Like most people haven't seen any role modeling for what that looks like.
Yes. Yeah. And I think that, I will also say that, sometimes clinically when I am helping assess, a breastfeeding, relationship, and, when I come in the postpartum period, there's almost always challenges. Mm-hmm. So it's a different, it's a different situation than just kind of in general. But, I do have some understanding of those healthcare providers that have that chart that has that, box that they need to put a number in or whatever. Because my system has that. And like I do sometimes ask that, but I also, I think it's important to have a holistic approach to assessing a breastfeeding relationship. And so if you're just looking at that number in absence of anything else, then that's not going to be helpful really to anybody, because a baby can be nursing really, really frequently and maybe, and it may not necessarily mean anything one way or another. Yeah. And a baby could be nursing, less frequently than quote unquote average and may be totally fine. And so I think that it's important to kind of have that as one piece of a larger puzzle or a larger kind of landscape of what is actually going on.
Well, and making note of and tracking what's happening as a tool for problem solving is different, I think, than like this is the normal expected and this is what you should be doing. So I completely and totally agree with you. And I do that with sleep a lot. Like a lot of my work is around sleep coaching, and I tell families like, don't track sleep, don't have a clock in the room. But if we're trying to problem solve something really specific and that information is valuable, then we will do it on a short-term basis to get a clearer picture of all the details. Yeah.
But I always feel empathetic when family, I ask like, how often are you nursing? And they're like, I'm sorry, I don't know, I'm not keeping track. And I'm like, that's totally fine. Like, are you nursing frequently? They're like, yes. Like, okay, great. Like, is it more than you can count? Fine. Like, have you been, and I sometimes feel like, that feels, easier. And there's, there may be a little bit of sort of like that apologetic nature, but that's better, I think, a lot of times than the flip side of that, where some of my clients have like have charted every single feeding or like are using an app and know down to the minute how many, how many minutes or seconds their baby's nursing. And I'm sort of like, I don't really need that. Like as long as it's,
and the times of every diaper and how much they weigh after every feeding. And I think a lot of that comes from, well, like we talked about, like getting back to that trust piece. Yeah. Like what would it feel like for you to set this down for let's start with 4 hours, for 4 hours, set this down, and what things are you feeling and what things are coming up for you and what fears are you having? And so, I've definitely done some work just on the like mothering side of working through a lot of that to open up the space for more trust to step in.
Yes.
Okay, now what about at night?
Right. Because I feel like this is the other thing that often gets asked in prenatal classes or, in the early days about like, what does that look like? And, when, like I remember one of my mentors saying like, you need to make it clear that you're not looking at kind of frequent, like saying how many times a day do you nurse is not accurate, because it's how many times in a 24-hour period if you're going to ask that question. Yes. Because a day, like different people have different ideas of what a day is. Totally. And so like really we wanted to say like in the last 24 hours if we're looking at really specific clinical information or,
Love the way you're intentional
whatever.
With that.
And so, I think that really like making sure that that's clear. And also I feel like, making sure that I tell prenatal classes about the realities of nursing around the clock and what night nursing, will include. And I think that some people worry that if you share those things, you might quote unquote scare away new parents from breastfeeding. But I really feel that families need to have kind of realistic expectations and understanding. Yes. And I just put it in the context of like, how is your, like when we're talking about prenatal classes, how is your baby eating right now? Like, how are they getting all their nutrients? And everybody's like, oh, like from the umbilical cord, constant. There's no there's no
24 hours a day.
Then it's 24 hours a day. Like that's what their metabolism is, used to. And so when we, expect them to have any amount of break between that connection that they have and their, needs being met, that's going to be a new thing for them. And I think that we also talk about like, when do you feel your baby most active? And most people will say, oh, when I lay down at night. Yep. Like when I, it's like, well, that is not going to, suddenly change when the baby's on the outside. That is part of, what your life is likely going to be. And that I think that it helps to just be informative and compassionate and help really to kind of empower them to picture what their lives will be like. And then once their baby's on the outside, I think families kind of figure out pretty quickly that this is what it means. I also like to share that in terms of, night nursing, that means that knowing that prolactin is highest, typically early in the morning, overnight, what we would think of as nighttime.
Yes.
That melatonin, babies are getting their melatonin at night, and
those are some of my favorite facts to share.
And
with
that
families.
this is just, what they're physiologically expecting, in terms of their metabolism, in terms of your milk production, in terms of melatonin, in terms of, not having a circadian rhythm at all in the early days and months. And so I feel like that can be really helpful, and that, this is how, staying in sync with nursing overnight means, frequent, waking, if that's what people want to like kind of think of it as, but that really, it's such that, it doesn't usually feel as challenging to wake up, that there's protective aspects of the hormones that make it not typically feel as exhausting as one would think. And some people actually say, like, I may be waking the same amount of time to, to tend to my baby in the night as I was to get up to pee, in the night when I was pregnant, but I don't feel as disturbed by it. And it's like, that's the hormones at play. That's, because there's, what is being expected.
This is definitely one of those areas where those mainstream expectations and systems really set women up to fail, because we set them up with this expectation and this pressure that your baby should be sleeping through the night. And we also have this expectation that you should be controlling and monitoring all of the aspects of breastfeeding. And then with this huge fear that you're not going to produce enough milk. And it's sort of this like perfect storm that creates this self-fulfilling prophecy. Right. If you sleep train your baby and stop nursing at night when your prolactin levels are highest, you're cutting out a huge portion of the amount of milk that they would be receiving. So then they're not gaining weight, like they should be. And it's just sort of all these things just snowball. And then your baby doesn't sleep well at night because they're not getting the melatonin that you produce in the evenings and throughout the night that helps them to sleep through the milk. And, all these things. And it just snowballs. So I think, I have this Sage sleep book, and half of the coaching I would say is actually sleep coaching. And what I do is I guide parents in honoring their little one's needs in ways that also meets mom needs. Because like when you throw the mainstream expectations and conventions out the window, you really get free to creatively and harmoniously be in connection with your little ones, even and especially at night. And that usually includes breastfeeding, because moms often have this mindset of it's like either or, like either you're getting up and sitting in a rocking chair in a nursery every 2 hours, or you're sleep training your baby and they're in a crib in their own room and you're in your bed. Like there's this whole other world of possibility in between those two things where you can be resting and sleeping and your baby can be nursing and resting and in connection.
Right. Yes. And I think that, I think that when we talk about what that looks like, and we talk about how, waking and the amount of kind of mental wakefulness on the part of the parent, how that can be minimized by sleeping close to or with your baby. And that studies have shown that, that's easier and better and safer, and that, most parents end up doing that whether or not they plan to or not. I think that it's important. And, I feel really fortunate. I was able to go see Dr. James McKenna, an anthropologist and sleep researcher, speak.
He's like a rock star.
He's such a rock star. Yeah. It was a day-long conference. I got to have lunch with him. It was great. And he coined the term breast sleeping. Yes. And he's been trying to kind of get that in the vocabulary of perinatal professionals. But he shares the quote that neither normal human healthy infant sleep nor normal human optimal breastfeeding is understood independent of the other, that they are both designed to happen together. And so he uses the term breast sleeping. And I think that it's just such a different but also old way of looking at it, like new and old. And
that's what the philosophy of all this natural parenting stuff is about, that we're talking about, this returning to this intuitive wisdom that we had for millions of years, and then it got sort of mucked up for a while there.
It's exactly. It's like how we're supposed to be caring for our babies around the clock, in close proximity, like responding to their cues. Yes. Like in the rhythms of, the seasons and the circadian rhythm and the sunlight and all of that. And I think that, we have other things that are at play, and we can take those into account, but that's like what our bodies are and our babies are like expecting. Yes. And I think it's important to recognize that. So
realistic expectations is kind of like the moral of the story that I'm taking from you from this conversation, that when it comes to the night nursing, like it's important for families to have realistic expectations of the fact that like parenting is a 24-hour job and you don't get night job. And it's normal and healthy for babies to nurse throughout the night. And then this other piece, which brings in the hope, like so that we're not, so it doesn't feel like fear mongering. Like there's this other piece that you can meet those needs in ways that you're also getting the rest that you need. Like the needs are not mutually exclusive.
Yes. And that it will continue to evolve, that it will not always be what it is, in the first, month or two. It will not always.
So my teenagers shouldn't be nursing every 2 hours at night?
But really, I mean, on a personal note, like I cannot imagine my life without sideline nursing. Like that was
that's everything.
That is like everything. Like I tell people like this is, it feels like a little bit of an advanced nursing position. Like it gets easy. Like if you try it and it doesn't feel like it's easy the first time, that's okay. Like you have one of your arms kind of out of commission because it's under you. Like
and you'll get the hang of it. It's kind of like riding a bike.
Exactly, really. And that there's really nothing quite like that middle of the night, sleepy suckling of a newborn, or that like cuddle and nursing, like check in with an older little one, like that. Those are like such sweet, precious memories that I hold, that like there isn't any of the distraction or the, hubbub of the day to to interrupt that connection. And I just think it's really, really amazingly sweet and special. And
this is such a perfect example too, because next I want to talk about nursing in public. And this is such a perfect like segue into it, because like natural breastfeeding positions and sideline nursing while sleeping, these types of things, this is all knowledge that like we had, in generations past, and that was passed on from generation to generation, and that we saw in all of the women around us as they went about living their lives with their little ones. And like I mentioned, like we've sort of lost a lot of that. And I even mentioned like the metaphor of riding a bike, that it's kind of, getting the hang of all this stuff is kind of like learning how to ride a bike. But if we grew up always seeing all of the people around us riding bikes, watching like the things that cause them to fall and how they get back on and where they put their water bottle and where, like if you grow up seeing all of these things, then it's much easier for you to stay uprighted when you hop on the bike. And so I think that's a really important piece to the breastfeeding and public conversation that I want to talk about. Because if we're breastfeeding on cue and living a life out in society, we are going to be nursing in public. And this is an issue I am fiercely passionate about, and I have been an advocate personally and professionally for a woman's right to breastfeed and a baby's right to eat, and in turn our rights to exist in public space for like over a decade. It's something that was completely normal throughout all of human history until like around our parents' generation, depending on how old or young you are, like when formula in bottles really became mainstream and we lost that role modeling. But I mean, thankfully, we've shifted the tide a great deal. And even between when I was nursing my first and my third, there was a tremendous difference in the public reception around us. So what hurdles have you seen undermining successful breastfeeding relationships in public, and how do you think we can overcome them?
Right. I think that it's, a huge part of it is cultural, of course. I think that, unfortunately successful breastfeeding relationships, are, seen as sort of not the norm. I feel like it's, I feel like a lot of it boils down to sort of this idea of, I think when I think about it, I think boiled down, it's mostly just patriarchy.
Oh my God, so much yes.
I feel like that's just like, if like all of the things, it's like, oh, this, and then it's like, oh, that's just patriarchy. Oh, well, also that, well, that's just patriarchy too. Like when you get down to it, it's just like that. And I feel like it's just this like, I think at its core, it tends to feel to me and to the people that I've talked to about this, that there is this hegemonic belief that breasts are or should be solely sexual. And I feel like people believe that, I believe that if people truly believed that they were primarily for nursing a child and secondarily for any sexual purposes, that we would have less taboo about nursing in public. I feel like a lot of the concern, modesty, shame that I hear from clients that are like, I want to be able to do this, but I don't know how to do this. I feel like it's mostly about other
smashing
people.
the patriarchy.
And it's mostly about, will I get into a confrontation? Will somebody tell me that I need to cover up or that I need to leave? Like, will I feel like I'm being, naughty, bad, whatever, by doing this? And it's like, that is like, this shows that this is not, seen as something that people are entitled to, and that there shouldn't be a second thought about feeding your baby wherever you are. And that almost every state has laws in place. I've heard that Idaho, which is the last state standing without a law on the books, is working to put one through. So pretty much every state in the U.S. has laws in place to protect the right to do so. And yet we still hear stories of families that are made to feel uncomfortable and that change their habits, or that feel like they need to stand up and they maybe don't have a voice in the moment, but maybe then it catches, somebody else's attention, or they reach out to the media or social media, and that there are campaigns for, nurses and things like that. And I'm all for that, but I think it's a much deeper level of work that's needed. I feel like children need to see babies nursing. Families need to have those tough conversations with older generations about why this is important, that even though, you were bottle fed doesn't mean that, that is what I want to do, or doesn't mean that, means that we shouldn't be doing this. I think that we need to have those, I know I won't go to another room, or, no, this is my space, or, anywhere my baby can be and I can be, we're allowed to do this. And so I think that is what we need to see. And I think we are seeing it. And especially, here in the Seattle area, I think that I see more, maybe it's because of my line of work and I'm more aware of it, but I see more of it. And I feel like, I see more uncovered nursing than I see a lot of covered nursing, which makes me, wonder, and I'm all for it if that's what somebody feels like they need or want to do. But it does make me question, like, do they feel comfortable enough to take the off if they wanted to? Like, what's going on there? And I know that for, many people, there are concerns about modesty and like how much skin is exposed. And I do a lot of teaching with clients about how to nurse discreetly if that's their goal. My personal favorite is like the 2-shirt method and carrier, but I think each person needs to sort of figure out what works best for them and their baby. And, I often talk about like, pull a chair up to a mirror and sort of practice, like, put on the clothes that you might wear out and like, sit there and kind of figure out like what you need to do. And like, if you're used to doing like a really reclined nursing position, like, maybe you won't want to do that like at the restaurant or on the park bench. Maybe you will, like, if that's what works best for you and your baby. But like, practice like some more, maybe, straight back chair, practice some more. Like, how do I unsnap my nursing bra and how do I pull this up? Because going back to your point about like, if we saw it all the time, like there is research that shows that when we as humans see somebody else doing a complicated task, the areas of our brain activate that would control our bodies doing those same things. And so it's a little bit of that psychological muscle memory sort of being built. I feel like if we had that sort of norm and expectation and like exposure to seeing people doing it, it not only would be less taboo, less of a thing. You wouldn't be like, oh, what is that person doing over there? You'd be like, oh, they're just feeding their baby. But also when you went to do it, you'd be like, oh, I know how to, do that quick lift, snuggle in, get latched on, thing.
Just like we know how to like eat with a fork.
Right.
Because it's like this is how we see people eat around us. And I was never sat down and instructed on how to eat with a fork. Like I just saw the people around me eating with forks. And so I figured it out. I probably dropped my fork a couple times. but yeah, like watching it, I think like there are a few like major pieces that I think of like that together create like this big barrier to fully shifting the cultural tide on this. There's like the education piece, and that like people don't understand that breasts are a secondary sex characteristic, like an Adam's apple. You know, it's a secondary sex characteristic, and that breasts can come into play in a sexual relationship just like a mouth can. Like I can eat my dinner at a dinner table in a restaurant, and I can make out with my husband. And that doesn't mean I need to cover my mouth when I'm outside of the bedroom.
Right.
like that, just there's this educational, like, logical, pieces that I think people, like, we have to have more conversations about that to sort of get at some of the fallacies that are underlying a lot of the arguments that are out there. And then there's, of course, that like cultural normalizing piece, that it sort of fell out of normalcy, you know, in recent history, recent in terms of like, you know, overall lifespan of humans on this planet. It's been so recent, but it sort of fell out of normalcy. So that piece of it being culturally normal and growing up seeing it around you and thinking that that's just how babies eat. And the more women who just, in living their lives with their babies and feeding them when they're hungry, that carves out the space for the woman to come behind you, you know, and to see that and to step into that space in your wake. And then, of course, there's the patriarchy piece, which I feel like could be its own episode.
Yes.
In and of itself.
Yes.
And I have to like cheddar my inner Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And then the legal piece, like, and
Yes.
I can't even tell you how many times I said, like, breastfeeding in public is actually a legally protected right in the state of California. I have the legal right to feed my baby anywhere my baby and I are legally permitted to be present. Like, I had to say that so many times back in the day with my first.
I used to work for the Breastfeeding Coalition of Washington when I was pregnant and before I sat for my board exams. And we had cards that would have the RCW like code printed with like the language. And then people would like feel like, oh, I can carry this around. And if somebody gives me any hassle, like I can just hand them the card. Like I don't even have to remember the thing. Like I could just hand them and say like, you are actually violating the law right now by asking me about this. And like, I'm okay. And I still occasionally get calls, but especially when I was in that position, I would get calls of people that were trying to figure out like, you know, I had this incident at this restaurant and I'm just wondering, like, I just need confirmation that I was in the right. And they get that. And then they're like, would somebody reach out to them on like, you know, from like an official, you know, you as a lactation consultant or somebody as, you know, an official, you know, in an official capacity to let them know. And I'm almost always happy to do that and just let people know, like, you know, just so you know, like this is, you know, it's illegal to hassle somebody about this. And like, unless you want like 100 breastfeeding moms to show up at your establishment and like let you know, you and your customers know that like you need some training on this, like you should really, you know, make sure that all your staff is educated about this so that you don't end up on the wrong side, you know, ethically or legally of this.
And that's what we need. Like, I have to give a shout out to Robin Kaplan, who is a lactation consultant in San Diego for the San Diego Breastfeeding Center. And she was giving out those cards that state the law on them. And she and I went on different news outlets a few different times talking about breastfeeding in public and, like natural weaning and all of that type of thing. Okay. So, which leads me into the next topic, which is full-term breastfeeding. The stigma definitely grows with your child. So the average age of weaning in the U.S. is something like 3 months. Like it's so young. While the worldwide age of natural weaning is somewhere around 4. And the World Health Organization recommends continued breastfeeding for 2 years and beyond, as is mutually desired by mother and baby. My last nursling breastfed for about 5 years. So what has your full-term nursing journey looks like? And then what does full-term breastfeeding really look like for other families? And what are some of the benefits?
Right. So we are actually still nursing, and I don't like to use the word still, but we are still nursing. And I think that a lot of people, it's not something that we keep a secret, but it's not something that we necessarily talk about a lot.
Right.
Because it's not often anymore. It's mainly around sleep times. It's usually brief these days. I feel the closing of this aspect of our relationship coming. I treasure our nursing sessions and all the memories that I have because I know that it will be done at some point, and we have the conversations about that. And I think that, full term breastfeeding just looks different for each dyad. I think it often looks like just continuing to nurse for the same reasons as you would in the early days, just less about the nutrition maybe because they're eating 3 meals a day and some snacks and can grab their water bottle. And, it maybe doesn't have all the same, needs for that, but there are still nutritional and immunological benefits to it. I think for many families who nurse beyond infancy, especially in the United States because of our statistics, it tends to be less visible because it's not usually happening in public or talking or being talked about as much. And I like to think that that's mainly based on practicality and not cultural stigma, but I know that it's probably both.
Yeah, it's definitely both.
Recently, my son and I, we were at a salad cafe, and he decided that he wanted to pick out our seats while I ordered. And so I got our food and I came over to him, and he was chatting with another woman, which is like super typical of him because he's a little extrovert,
so him,
like me. Yeah. And she told me what they'd been talking about, and we continued chatting for a little bit. And I can't recall exactly why, but he told her that he does nursing, which is the phrase that he uses. We've never used like a slang word or code word or anything, and he doesn't like see this as part of his life that should be secretive. So he's just like, chatting with this woman about like, yeah, and I love nursing. And I had that moment of like, oh, let's see how she responds to this.
Right.
And she was very pleasant. And she said that she thinks she knows another child around his age who does too. And my kiddo is like very articulate, like comes across as even older than he is to a lot of people. And so I was just like, oh, that's so nice that she like said that and didn't like give him a weird look and like get her book.
Awesome.
Oh, good. Like, and then later we we talked about how like not everybody may be accepting of the idea of, a child his age breastfeeding, and that he knows that in the US and many parts of the world, like many babies don't do any nursing or they stop before they're very old. We talked about the reasons for that and like how my work is to help families reach their goals. And, he knows all of that. But he, has told me that how lucky he feels that he is able to have nursing for so long, and that he knows that it's coming to an end. And years ago, my sister asked him, he was probably like 2 or 3 at the time, and she was like, how long do you think that you and Mama are going to nurse her? He's like, probably like 5 or 8. Yeah, maybe not 8. Like, we'll see. But we're coming up on 5. And
when people would ask West, he would say forever. I'm going to nurse forever.
Exactly. Yeah. And we've talked about like he still like he thinks that we're all going to live together forever. And so like, he knows that like not like that. Yeah, he knows that he will stop nursing, but he does think that we will probably sleep in the same bed and like live in the same house for long. I'm like, well, maybe you won't want to when you get older. And he's like, no, Mama, I will. I'm like, okay, we'll see.
Just take the love. Just take it in. Be like, okay, baby.
Right. Did I cover all the points that you asked? Oh, wait, you asked about benefits. So I would say connection, reconnection after, like that kind of turning back into each other, slowing down. I think like for me, especially once I had a toddler, like being able to use nursing as a time for me to slow down, to like physically breathe and to like relax and have some mindfulness. I think, like I said, the nutrients and the antibodies and all the same things, just in different doses. And sometimes the doses are actually higher after infancy in terms of, certain things. I don't usually talk about the benefits of breastfeeding because I view them as the physiologic norm. And so like when I talk about, like the reasons for breastfeeding or the, things, I try to get my clients or get my class, attendees to like provide those things, but not couch it in the terms of benefits.
Right. Oh, I love that. I love that important semantic distinction. Yeah. That this is the physiological norm and standard for human beings.
and that like we're meant to breastfeed, we're meant to continue to breastfeed much longer than our current sociological realities, that like this is just part of it, and that like actually the American Academy of Pediatrics is the only health body that doesn't recommend a minimum of 2 years. Like the World Health Organization, the Canadian Pediatric Society, like all of the other, big ones recommend a minimum of 2 years. I went to a conference this past week, and one of the speakers said that she was told by somebody in the know within the U.S. kind of healthcare system that the reason for that, the reason why they said 1 year instead of 2, was that they felt that that was all that U.S. families could handle. I just felt like that is so underestimating and like blaming individual families, but also acknowledgement of the structural barriers to full-term breastfeeding that so many families face. And so they're saying like, we don't think families can handle breastfeeding beyond a year because they're not even doing it to 6 months for the most part. But then they're also stating that they're, thankfully they also go on to say that like there's no upper limit to the duration of breastfeeding, and that there's no evidence of harm, physiologic or developmental harm. Because I think that's what
which is important to state. Yeah, because that helps to break down a lot of those, a lot of those misconceptions and those fallacies that trip people up.
Yes. So I think that, ideally the cultural norms will shift and families will be able to set their own goals, and then they'll get the support that they need to do that. But, and maybe my kiddo talking with folks in public.
Yes, he's helping to pave the way and plant seeds, as I like to say. You guys are helping to plant seeds. Okay, so let's talk about weaning. So if we're talking about full-term breastfeeding and we're talking about following your child's lead and sort of allowing them to blossom in their own time toward independence, natural weaning is when the child simply nurses less and less and eventually stops breastfeeding altogether. You can follow your child's lead and they will eventually outgrow the need and desire for breastfeeding. But of course, breastfeeding is a relationship, and the other half of that relationship includes mom's needs and desires. So why don't you talk about some of the ways you can gently and respectfully nudge your child down the path of weaning?
Right. So yes, ideally it will happen, from, the perspectives of physiology and psychologic, health. It's going to, ideally happen gradually and respectfully, but there are ways that, that we can do that kind of nudge. And that, I think often begins with discussing. It's okay. Here, I'll help you.
I love when the kids come in to the podcast.
Like in Joe's episode.
Yes. Yeah. I love it. I like the interruptions.
That's the headset. Yeah. I'm talking to Rachel.
Hi, Kona.
Okay, here you go. Sorry, where was I? Okay, so shifting gears. So yes. So I think that begins by often discussing the transition with the child. I think that, some people like to sort of do it like, we're not going to talk about it. Like, we'll just see what happens. Like, and I think that you know your child best. So if talking about it will make it, like a sad, scary thing on the horizon, then I think it's like, you don't have to. But I think for most clients that I work with, when we're talking about, weaning and the process, I think we want to talk about, being respectful and that not kind of springing it on them. And so usually that involves a little bit of a heads up, and then being able to like really hear the emotions that come up with that, and honor those, because, both on the emotions that come up with the thoughts of weaning on the part of the child and also on the part of the parent. I think the other thing, go ahead.
There definitely is a balance. And I love that you brought that up because like, I'm a talker, like my background is in therapy. Obviously, I think that like talking is the way, but of course that's not every little one's language. And what I have seen sometimes is that when a mom is starting to feel, some feelings about wanting to move toward weaning, but they can see that their little one is really not in, a great place for it. They'll talk about it a whole lot, and it will create a great deal of anxiety around it, where there maybe had not been before. So I think that you are totally right that being like open in conversation and sort of setting the idea of it and the notion of it out into the conversation and onto the table for them to play with and try on is ideal. And to also, on the flip side, be aware of not building up a lot of fear or anxiety around something that can unfold in a really positive way.
Right.
Right. Because if your kid's super attached to it, and that's probably what I actually see is usually we sort of can fall into the cycle that when a child is feeling very anxious and insecure, which all humans go through phases where something will happen or they'll reach some new developmental awareness and they'll go through a small phase of that. And some parents, especially on the mainstream path, might describe it as like needy. Then we feel this reaction to want to push them away. And the more we push, the more desperate they cling.
Yes.
So we can sort of fall into this cycle. And I have seen, particularly with weaning, I've seen some mom and kids fall into that cycle. And so I'll say, you know what, for 1 month, you're not going to say a single word about weaning. And so if the child brings it up, like you can respond to any questions they have, but let's hold the space for just security, and so everyone's anxiety can lower. And then we can start introducing it again without all of the desperation and emotional baggage around it. So I think that definitely, and I'm sorry, I'm totally hijacking your point.
No, I love that. I love that.
Yeah, I just, to like introduce it gently and I guess without your emotional baggage.
Yes. Yeah, and when I do weaning consults, I often talk about the temperament of the child and the ways that the parents respond to the child's needs and how they hold space and set boundaries and other non-nursing related things, because I think that can be really informative. And I think that, parents know their child best. And so oftentimes when, you put it into context about, their day-to-day lives or about, other experiences that they've had up until that point, I think that it helps sort of frame it as this is not, this sort of isolated variable. This is just, another aspect of your journey And
introducing boundaries that make you feel more comfortable is completely 100% okay. It doesn't even necessarily have to be talked about in the context of weaning, but just in the sense of boundaries and body ownership. Like I own my body and you own your body, and we need consent, when we're engaging in these things, and this doesn't feel good for me and this feels okay for me, and that it's completely healthy and normal and fantastic role modeling to set boundaries. And how do you follow through with those boundaries, and how can you set them up for success with the boundaries that you put in place? So just like you were saying, I absolutely agree that this is more of a parenting exercise, than something that is isolated to breastfeeding itself. And the other thing that I really wanted to touch on too, and I'm sure you have lots of other really good stuff to say, is that before we even introduce the idea of pulling something back, we have to add in some other things. So your little one would have all of these wonderful, loving, secure, satiated feelings associated with breastfeeding. Often, a lot of times they'll be wrapped around sleep too. And so before, if we just introduce, hey, I'm going to take this away, like that can be tremendously scary. But if we introduce and build in all of these other new associations, like when your little one gets hurt, what things can you do in addition to breastfeeding? Like we want to marry some more things in, some more tools and some more avenues of connection, and how do we communicate and show our love and our comfort and our, nourishing, and how do we do all of that? We need to add in some extra layers. And then when we talk about pulling back on one of the things, it's not scary and it doesn't feel too much, and it doesn't feel too hard.
Yes. Yeah. My sister recently weaned my niece, and my sister and my niece recently weaned, but it was a little bit, more of a nudge on my sister's part, but she was talking about it with Coda, and he said, but what will happen if she gets hurt? How will you comfort her? And my sister was like, I'll cuddle her and I'll talk to her and I'll do, do all the things that I do with you when you get hurt. And he was like, oh, and I thought it was so like sweet and cute, but also funny because like we haven't nursed as a result of an injury for a long time. And so I'm like, he knows that, but he just like, his brain goes to like the idea that when you get hurt, like you'll get to do nursing and like it'll be like a way to get comfort. And it is, but it doesn't have to be the only way. And so once you have that, awareness of alternatives, then I think that it feels
like when we were the last time we were playing together, my little one fell down and got this like gnarly scrape burn, like friction burn on, I think it was his elbow, right? And your sweet Coda came over and rested his hand gently on his shoulder and, was talking to him and just being present with him, and so sweet. And so a lot of times our kids do those like really empathy. They have more skills than they're even aware of. So even just having those conversations about, again, not about, hey, weaning's going to end, but about, or, weaning's happening, breastfeeding is leaving the station, but more about, I noticed when your friend was hurt that you were doing some really wonderful things that were helping them to feel so soothed and better. You were, touching gently for some physical, connection, and you had these very gentle, empathetic words where you were saying that you understood how that might feel. And, you ask just all of this, just conversations to bring into their awareness all of the other things that are between the two of you and that you do share in addition to the breastfeeding. Yes, exactly. Yeah. Yeah. And I think going back to the concept of boundaries, like I've had so many clients that when we talk about, they set up a weaning consult, and when we get into it, it's clear that they don't necessarily want to completely wean, but they need or want more boundaries. And they need to be able to like say, like, I don't want to do it now, or I only want to do it in this. And it's like, oh yeah, you can do that. That's like totally possible. It doesn't have to be all or nothing. And then sometimes it's like, okay, night nursing is going to be done. Like we're just going to night wean, or like, I just want to nurse at these times of day. And like, I don't want it to feel like I have to do it. And I'm like, sure, yes, let's find, you that path to that. Yeah. Like we don't need to throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. And that you can reduce those sessions over time, and you can, take away that least favorite nursing session first, and then stick with that for a little bit, and then gradually drop sessions, or you can put those boundaries, or time limit, gentle limits. I think that a lot of people are really like surprised that you can like have a gentle limit around nursing, and that you might have like a way of like,
singing a song is my favorite way to help with that. Yep.
Yeah. So like we can keep nursing until I finish the song, and then we're going to stop, and then, making sure that it's clear, that, that there's the boundary, and that's what we're going to do. And, that's okay.
And to follow through with it with consistency. And if you follow through with it with consistency, the general rule of thumb is any transition you're trying to move through, if you're following through with 100% consistency and total non-reactivity, like an empathy, meaning your connection feels completely secure and they sense your calm and your confidence, then it takes max 3 days to move through any transition. So even if it feels hard, it's going to be really hard the first day. It tends to be even harder the second day. Then the third day, there's a huge drop off and it's not that hard. And then the fourth day, it feels like you're completely through it. So it may seem like a really big hurdle, but as long as, you're not, I think my big piece is that we never want to, isolate or remove the connection of the primary attachment figure. And as the research shows that as long as they have you, the cortisol levels are not spiking. So for example, it's the difference between like a baby crying in arms and a baby crying alone in a crib, where it's processed as abandonment, whereas crying in your arms, it's processed like as a release of stress. And so it's the same thing when you're trying to build in a new boundary, is that you can support that boundary in loving and empathetic connection. And then as long as you're sensitive and consistent, you can move through it pretty quickly.
Yes, I love that.
Joy and I continued talking for another 45 minutes, diving into all of the misconceptions about breastfeeding. So it was a really great talk. And if you want to hear all of that bonus content, simply become a patron over on Patreon and you unlock this entire bonus episode. Now we're going to get into our Q&A. So this one, I know we were talking about both of us being particularly passionate about smashing the patriarchy. And this one is, what if your partner is uncomfortable with breastfeeding? I have worked with a lot of families where typically the husband will say something like, I'm okay with her breastfeeding for 6 months, but after that, I'm not okay with it. Or I'm uncomfortable with my wife breastfeeding in public, not comfortable with it. To which I snarkily respond, then you don't have to breastfeed in public. So how do you respond to that cue?
Yeah, so I think if I were hearing from the breastfeeding parent, chest feeding parent, and their partner, and they were sharing that their partner didn't feel comfortable, I would have a different conversation than if we were together there at them as a partnership and me chatting. But I would really want to start by asking some open-ended questions and then really listening to those concerns, because I think
so snarky quips is not the right way for me to go. Is that what you're saying?
I think it's the right way, but I have every trust that you could then go deeper than that. I know.
Okay, fair enough.
So I think it's fine to throw that out there and see how it lands, and then
be snarky and then shame your husband as an anti-feminist. That's not the best plan.
Well, if the shoe fits, but
okay, sorry, continue.
I wouldn't know. I can't speak to that, but I would just say that active listening is probably a good path. But I feel like if you know what specifically makes them uncomfortable about that, like if you can say well, why 6 months? What does that mean? Or, what would it mean if you were together and the baby was clearly hungry and you were in public and there was no other option? Would the alternative of loading the baby in the car and driving, home, be and listening to baby cry? Is that what you are what are you imagining? What is the concern?
Unpack the baggage.
Exactly. And then, what are the feelings beneath that discomfort? Because is it that idea that breasts are sexual? Is it jealousy? Is it, some concern for the well-being of the nursing parent? I hear that a lot, where it's sort of well, I just don't want her to have to sacrifice herself for, around the clock or forever or whatever. And it's sort of that altruistic thing, but that undermines the relationship. So I think if the discomfort is vague, there's often a deeper meaning. So I'd want to be able to explore that.
Yes.
If it's something that comes up pre-baby or in the early days, I think it warrants some immediate time and attention, and perhaps, reaching out to a professional like a therapist to make sure that everyone's as much on the same page as possible with their intentions and goals, because it can be it can be the difference between that breastfeeding relationship or chest feeding relationship flourishing or it being sabotaged.
Absolutely.
Getting a partner on board is vital.
It's going to be your biggest ally, having a partner who's supportive of your breastfeeding relationship.
Exactly. And we know from research that mothers feel more capable and confident about breastfeeding when they perceive that their partners are supportive. Yeah. So when partners use verbal encouragement and when they're actively involved in breastfeeding and other kind of baby, tasks related to breastfeeding, that, the partners that are ambivalent or that only want to do it because of, what's best for the baby, or of course, partners that are negative about breastfeeding, that those parents felt less confident and then weaned sooner because they didn't have that support.
Yeah. And so I think it's definitely worth digging underneath those surface level fears and really getting down to the deeper nether regions of the psyche and figuring out where all the fears are coming from and finding ways to shift, the relationship to these ideas. And I think that's definitely a process worth engaging in. I also feel, though, that there is this piece of boundaries that is okay to bring into the conversation around your body, your body, your choice. Mm-hmm. I think that a lot of people supporting families are really tentative to introduce that option. And I just want to put that on the table as well, that you should definitely, or not should, but you can definitely be engaging in these really important conversations and trying to get at the heart of what these issues are and figure out how you can work together, because your partner wants to be a supportive partner and help you to be the best mother or parent that you can be, and vice versa. And so this is absolutely a way that your relationship can grow and improve and deepen, and you can both evolve for the better. And it's also okay to have a boundary in place. For example, if we are in public and our baby is hungry and you can't be supportive in that moment, take a walk so that I at least don't have to carry the weight of the negativity. You know what I'm saying? Like,
yes.
There's some negotiation and boundaries that are okay to put in place in the interim while you're working through that process of growing together.
Yeah, I like that idea.
Okay, now a day in the life. Describe your favorite day in the last week or so and share with us why you loved it.
Oh, I love this question. I love hearing your other guests share this. So, so it's fun to think back about mine. So mine would definitely be this past Saturday. It was my wife's birthday.
Happy birthday, wife. What's your wife's name?
Christine.
Happy birthday, Christine.
Yeah. So, we have birthdays close together, and sometimes we do sort of a joint thing. And this year we weren't sure what we were going to do. But we decided to make, we always make it special. Birthdays are like the biggest holidays in my perspective.
Yay, I love that.
So we woke up and we had just a nice breakfast at home, and we were in the kitchen and we saw a northern flicker, which is like a type of woodpecker, out of our kitchen window. And so we got out the field guide and we were reading about them, and we ended up looking at of course, Coda looked at the bug section. So then that led to us looking at common water bugs or common water striders. And so then we had to find a video to watch of them moving on the water to kind of see how they move. So then that led to us learning about surface tension, which allows them to do that.
You tumble down the rabbit hole of natural learning.
Exactly. So we're learning about like molecular structure of water molecules that allows the surface tension. And then of course we had to do like a little experiment to get like a paper clip to float on the water to show surface tension. So we're like doing all of this. Like, it doesn't take that long to do any of this.
Yeah.
But it was just a sweet moment of impromptu learning in the morning. And then after that we went over to our local market, and Christine got a haircut, and then Coda and I picked out some flowers for a bouquet for mommy, and he got to pick all the stems and put them into get them wrapped up. And then we were done, and she wasn't quite done yet. So he said, "Mama, can we sit in the sunshine and read?" And I was like, "Yes, we can. That sounds lovely." So we sat in the sunshine and read for a little bit. And then we came home and we had lunch. And then Christine and I headed to downtown Seattle for a staycation. So we went to see Hamilton, and we had a fancy dinner with some friends, and we had an overnight at a hotel, and it was very luxurious, and it was a great opportunity to kind of take some time and celebrate and have some one-on-one time together. And I love, in all of the stuff that you share and your other podcasts, that idea of an integrated life. And I don't feel the need to leave my kiddo. This was really the fourth overnight away from him since he was born. And all of those have been in the last 2 years or so. So it's sort of an unusual, not a big deal, but sort of, not our norm. But it felt really
it felt good.
And it also felt nice to know that he was at home with my mother-in-law who lives with us, and he had his own space and routine, but we topped it up. It was special. He got to stay up late and watch watch some movie or show or something. And I knew that she would lay in bed with him until he fell asleep.
Special experiences all around.
Yes, exactly. So it was just a really fun, full day with lots of memories, and just, one of those times where you're just this is my life. This is so cool.
Profound moment of gratitude.
Yes, definitely.
I love that.
Yeah.
All right. Now, we mentioned lots of resources throughout this episode, and I will link to all of those, but it's time for the deep dive. So what are your favorite resources for families to learn more about breastfeeding?
Yes. My website has my offerings. So if folks need like individual, support and attention with breastfeeding, I'm happy to be a resource.
I love your
book.
business name, by the way. Like the
Thank
first time I
you.
saw that, I was like, oh my God, that's so cute. So her business name is Sound Beginnings. And of course, in Washington, we live around the sound. Just the cutest business name ever.
Yes, and then the double meaning of like
Yeah.
safe and sound or
Yeah.
sound, and yeah. So, I was Sound Doula, and then I was Sound Breastfeeding, and now I'm Sound Beginnings, which sort of is the umbrella that can
I
encompass
love
whatever.
it.
Yeah, and then I love your Sage Breastfeeding book. I feel like it's such an easy like read that touches on all the key points and really like helps people feel that trust and that path forward to figuring out for them. So I definitely add that to the list. I think we've been talking a lot about sleep. I think the La Leche League Sweet Sleep book is a nice resource that has a lot of good info that can be helpful in terms of that kind of realistic expectations and sort of understanding what that might look like at different points, and it's very affirming of the what will likely be happening, and helps people kind of figure out some of those things. I think I mentioned kellymom.com. I think that's a good kind of general resources about breastfeeding if folks need to kind of find something. And I always recommend going to that one's like curated by an IBCLC, and so I always recommend like going to some source that's a trusted source versus just like Dr. Google. Like if you put in something in a search engine and you will get all kinds of stuff that may or may not pertain.
You're gonna land in all kinds of like ignorant, asinine like blog posts.
Right. Yes. That you're going to be like, do I have thrush and, a tongue tie and
I'm going to burn in hell for a lack of modesty.
Right. Yes. And all of these things, and it's all terrible. Whereas, no, it's probably none of those things, or maybe it is, and you can get some more trusted resources and support. So that I think is good to just sort of have like a person that you can call, or a website that you can search within, or something along those lines, I think can be helpful. There's so many really great Facebook groups that can be helpful for kind of navigating some of these, but some of them will also have, information that may or may not be helpful. So I think that sort of use your discretion sort of thing. And then we've been talking a lot about culture and feminism and things like that. And there is a book that came out in the last year or so by Kimberly Sears Allers, and it's called The Big Letdown: How Medicine, Big Business, and Feminism Undermine Breastfeeding. And this book really combines my love of cultural analysis and lactation. And I have a master's in cultural studies and like analyzing culture and like figuring out like why things are the way they are, and how can we change them. I am
so excited about this book. So I've never read it, and you sent me like the title of it when we were getting ready for this episode, and I got like my eyes got all big and my eyelids got all fluttery. I'm very excited to get my hands on this book and give it a read because it sounds awesome.
Yes.
And I want to say, too, with the Facebook groups, it's so funny because, we talked about the cultural tide shifting, and it's been from, like, rad advocate mamas, like, living their truth and standing up for their rights and whatnot. And when I first started breastfeeding, my oldest is now 12, and the other, like, the online communities that I would connect with, it was, like, all super crunchy moms. And, like, all, like... like our jam, like bed sharing and baby wearing before like Target and Babies R Us sold pouches. Like this was like back in the day. Like baby wearing, everyone thought I was like an alien when I walked around with my kids strapped to my chest. Like, yeah. And so nowadays, though, then when like I had my third and I'm in the online groups, it's been like such a marked difference where most of them are totally mainstream now, which like is an awesome sign of progress that breastfeeding is now like more of a mainstream norm. So it's like awesome, and I'm happy about it. But that also means that if you're trying to connect with other people and looking for like trusted, like-minded guidance around breastfeeding, you have to look a little harder to find a group that's like a good match for you, a good fit.
Yes. Yeah, but I feel like even with all of my like knowledge and confidence in what we're doing, like I still find that in those groups where people like, it's not a big deal if you have a 3, 4, 5-year-old that's nursing, like it can be affirming if you feel like you don't see that in your day-to-day life. And I think that it can be nice to sort of, or if you feel like, you have those like interactions with healthcare providers or whatever that you just need to vent about, like you're not going to get somebody that, that questions that. They're going to be like, oh yeah, like totally, and that's not okay, and I'm sorry you dealt with that, and like I had something too, and you get that like commiseration and or
camaraderie
space, camaraderie, and that that sort of like-minded honoring your experience and all of that. So yes.
Thank you so much for talking with me today, Joy. I took up way more of your time than I asked for.
No, this is so fun. Yeah, thanks for dealing with my interruptions and my family coming home and the dog running through and the sound coming on and all that.
I love it. It's the sound of family. That's my favorite sound.